Hi everyone, welcome to the session Alternative Complaint Resolution Approaches, Mediation and Handling Challenging Behaviour. So, conflict is the beginning of consciousness, said Mary Esther Harding, who was an associate of Carl Jung. And in a way, that very much reflects the kind of thinking behind mediation and what we would see as effective conflict resolution, which is that it's an opportunity to wake up to become more aware of particular things rather than for it to be only some kind of difficult situation, because often it's more about how conflict is responded to that leads to the difficulties than the conflict itself. Next slide, please. So, a preview of the session message is that we're going to be looking at how labelling complainants inhibits resolution of complaints and indicates a resistance to learning and change. So it's effectively a form of denial when labels for the people that complain, which I'll expand on in a second. Mediation, looking at far more effective and how it's far more effective and frequently used if positioned alongside a complaints procedure rather than be integrated within one. Again, we'll look at that, but very often mediation is more and more, it seems, it's integrated within procedures rather than used as a genuine alternative, which is how it's meant to be used effectively. Revisiting what constitutes effective listening. So how effective listening can enable an early establishment of a cooperative adult relationship for resolution of complaints rather than a parent-child delivery of answers that often don't fit what the complaint is about, particularly where responses are standardized and not bespoke, thus leading to complainants returning persistently. Next slide, please. So in terms of stereotypes and labels that can occur for complainants and how that then inhibits learning and change and growth for the organisation. When we label someone, in many ways they become dead to us. We think we know all about them, so we stop listening to them or asking them questions. We put them in a box, and labels don't breathe or change. Next slide, please. So the kinds of stereotypes and labels that I'm talking about are things like difficult customer, serial complainer, difficult person, etc. And these are all the kinds of labels that we hear as mediators used about people who complain. And they're often treated as if they're kind of objective descriptions, but in fact they're obviously always subjective. And in a sense, my question today is, what is the impact on how the person is responded to at organisational and staff levels when the label is applied? The label becomes an indication, and this is what I'm kind of putting out there for you to consider, it becomes an indication of resistance to reflect and learn and change, which is what has been mentioned today as being a hoped for outcome of complaints procedures. And what we're kind of discussing today is the ways in which actually that often doesn't and can't happen. There becomes a focus on the person and managing them rather than on continuing to work cooperatively with them to create an answer to their inquiry or complaint. And an effective way of doing that starts with effective listening, which is kind of a cliche, but it actually very rarely occurs. Next slide, please. In my experience, without exception, and that really is the case, in mediations where such labels have been given about a member of the public or a patient or a service user or a customer, the most significant factor has always been that they've just not felt listened to, and the label has been used to try to rationalise why the person keeps returning. So instead of it being, actually, could we listen to this person more effectively and how could we go about doing that, it's, well, the reason they're not accepting our answer is because they're a difficult person, they're a persistent complainer, they're a vexatious complainant, they haven't got anything else to do with their time, etc. These kinds of dismissive comments are used, and I would challenge you to think, wherever you hear that about complainants, Where are you not listening and not learning, or your organisation doing that? If you hear that kind of phraseology used amongst your staff, very often answers that have been given are not to what the person is bringing, but to something else assumed to be the case, because there hasn't been clarification through initial effective listening. And sometimes responses are systematized, and so they intrinsically fail to meet the individual inquiry or complaint, because the system can't know what their individual concerns are. And quite often the approaches used are made with the intention of it being efficient, but unfortunately it doesn't prove to be effective when such things are systematized, and so it doesn't work. Next slide, please. So follow-up complaints from inaccurate responses can then include criticism of the organisation, and so this is where it becomes a backwards and forwards of labels. The customer or complainant might also then make labels about the organisation or the individual they're working with, and then the response focus is distracted onto defending against the criticisms that are made, rather than keeping the focus on ensuring clarity of what the person is complaining about and wanting as an outcome, and moving towards resolution of that. So just a couple of kind of anecdotal examples. Susie and I used to manage a community mediation service, and we had one of our volunteer mediators worked for a health body, focusing on a particular area of practice. And she worked alongside as a support role to the CEO, and he knew that she worked as a mediator. So when a complaint came to him from someone described as a persistent complainer, he passed it to her to kind of look at, to create a response to. So she went through the correspondence and literally piece by piece picked out all the issues that had been raised by the complainant, and bullet pointed them and responded to each one of them, and that resolved the issue. The person felt satisfied with that outcome. Now you could think, well, if it's gone through all these different levels, why hadn't that happened earlier? And I would propose, and based on what she was saying as well, it's very much because they weren't actually addressed. Whereas there can often be an assumption that they are, but often what's being addressed is what people assume the person's complaining about because they haven't listened to them effectively, or sometimes they're just standard responses. So in terms of standard responses, my own recent experience was I made an FOI request about the level to which mediation was used in 16 different universities that I contacted. I was just asking simple things like, how many mediators do you have? How many cases do you do? What kinds of disputes do you provide mediation for within your university? And other small related questions. 12 of the 16 responded straight away with the information. 4 said that my complaint, my inquiry rather, was vexatious. Simply asking that kind of information. So they didn't provide the information. As you may know, I have a right to request an internal review, which is what I did. 3 of them came back straight away and said, oh, yep, we've looked at it. Here is the information. One of them, however, so just to say, I think the fact they did a review is a good thing, but one wonders why the standard response was to call my request vexatious right from the start. But they did a review and they provided the information. One remains, however, that has given a long legal outline of why such an outrageous request is vexatious. And so, of course, what I've done is I've passed it through to the ICO to explore. But I kind of think, why have they made so much work for themselves? I may be wrong. Maybe I'll be told that I didn't have a right to that information, in which case perhaps the other 15 need to learn something. But I'm pretty unlikely to have the this kind of resistance upheld. And I kind of wonder why they have and want to entrench such a standardized response, and how many other complaints they receive because of it. So what are the stereotypes that you hear or that you use yourself in your organisation about people who complain? Where or what are you not learning as a consequence of defaulting to that kind of labeling of people, because they have a lot to contribute to the learning of the organisation if there's an openness to hearing it and if there's effective listening to what they're saying. Next slide, please. So now on to mediation and standardising and optimising use of mediation as an alternative option available for complainants and staff when dealing with complaints. So there can often be what I find quite odd integration of mediation within an adversarial procedure. And I literally could talk for 2 hours about why this is such an ineffective use of mediation, and this is a much more effective use, an appropriate use of mediation, because it's always designed to be an alternative process to an adversarial process, not a step within it. But just as a starting point, I used to be an NHS complaints mediator for primary care complaints in a 3-borough London Health Authority. And when I arrived, this was the system that they used. My predecessor had done 6 cases during the past year. 6 isn't very many. And some of their cases, for some reason, were lasting months to take through. I asked them to change the system to this system. So there was no expectation at a particular stage for mediation to be used, but instead it was offered throughout the life of the complaint. And that was simply by doing things like asking for a box to be put at the bottom of any standard letters that went out saying, there is mediation available for your complaint. Should you wish to find out more about this via a no commitment discussion, please contact the mediator on this number. And I also asked the complaints officers to say in any conversation, just to remind you there is mediation available. If you'd like me to put you through to the mediator or to ask them to contact you, please let me know. It'll be a no commitment discussion, but just to give you an idea of what mediation involves and how it can help. So I mentioned that my predecessor did 6 cases. In this, when it changed to this system, I did 36 cases in 10 months. And for some reason, it kind of seems to be counterintuitive for a lot of people that if you don't force it in there, people won't use mediation. But it's the very forcing of it that means people resist it, because it may not be at the right time for them. They may feel resentful that they're being pushed into it. They'll become suspicious of it. Whereas when it's a clearly open and free choice to try mediation, people are much, much more likely to use it, as those figures show, a 6-fold increase in the level of use of mediation. But there are so many other benefits to using this approach than this one, and both in terms of the effectiveness of the process, but also in terms of the level of take-up. But unfortunately, there isn't time here, so I'll have to move on to the next stage. Next slide, please. So why does involving a third party, such as mediation, that practices in this way provide a beneficial alternative approach to a complaint? So mediators don't give advice, suggestions, opinions or solutions. So that's what makes it different, and importantly different, to an adversarial process. It's important and correct that there should be adversarial processes where a third party explores and then gives an opinion or a decision about what should happen. But in many complaints, that may be very difficult to be clearly elicited from what's happened. And the point of mediation is that people get to understand that they're not turning up to persuade us of the rightness of their view and the wrongness of the other in the hope that we will give advice, suggestions, opinions or solutions that favour them over the other person. But we're very clear we're not going to do that. So the whole point is that they have to work together in the process as it's they that create the outcome for and by themselves. And so they need each other's favour for any outcomes created. So therefore, when they create an outcome, they know that it's in both of their interests. Caveats to this, I would say, are when actually you get representatives speak for the parties, in which case it basically turns it back into an adversarial process, because the participants aren't creating it for and by themselves. The mediator's role is therefore to support the creativity of the participants in creating this or achieving this through questioning skills and reflective listening. And the point being that their creativity is inhibited when they're given advice, solutions, ideas, and opinions. So a kind of a metaphor we use for that is if or two people are standing in front of a blank canvas and they want to create something together, the second I, as the mediator, kind of grab the brush and start splattering something on it, it's immediately destroyed their own decisions and ideas for how they're going to create something. So the mediator effectively stands with the palette of resources that they see available to themselves, and we simply support them in deciding what they want to create. We don't do it for them. We don't splatter our ideas all over their canvas. Next slide, please. So cooperating with service users to understand expectations and achieve better outcomes. So peace is not the absence of conflict. So it's accepting there will always be conflict, but the presence of creative alternatives for responding to it. So creative alternatives, not kind of entrenched reactions to it. Next slide, please. So a kind of a manifestation of that is that I'm often asked for training in managing serial complainers or difficult people, or recognizing the signs of a difficult person, as if they kind of carry a big stamp on their head saying I'm a difficult person, or act in certain ways. But these all suggest a wary, kind of fearful, arm's length, almost paranoid perception by the organization of a complainant. They haven't learned from their experience of complainants to deal with different ways of presenting a complaint. Because it shouldn't really matter who it is who's making the complaint, because what matters is resolving the complaint, not kind of adjusting behaviours to deal with different types of people. And so some of the recent training that I've been doing through Westminster Insight has been how to engage with the complainant or customer as a co-creator of a way forward via an adult relationship, and not a kind of a parent naughty child relationship, which can often be a perception of relationships with complainants, as if the complainant is a nuisance or too demanding, or they're attention seeking, or they've got nothing else to do with their time, etc. So these kind of dismissive comments occur, which obviously therefore distract from dealing with the actual issue. So my question is, have you heard those kinds of phrases used? Do you use them? So all of them are all such dismissals are lost opportunities for learning from the complaint that's being raised and how it's being raised by the complainant. They're all opportunities for learning. So embedding conflict resolution support skills in complaint handling procedures. And so note here, I'm not saying resolving conflict for complainants, but working with them using those conflict resolution support skills, because the conflict is the complaint. It doesn't have to become a personal conflict with the other person. The conflict that's presented is the complaint. So working with them to resolve the difficulty together. And part of the reason that doesn't always work is because the classic rescuer syndrome can manifest at organisational level as well, where complainants get fixed with a fix that doesn't work for them. So instead of working with them to create it together in an adult type relationship, there's this person doesn't know the answer, so I'm just going to deliver it to them. But it isn't therefore clear that that fix works for them. And so therefore when they return dissatisfied with that outcome, they can be seen as ungrateful. Be grateful, you difficult person. Or vexatious and having other motives than simply wanting to have their complaint or inquiry listened to and accurately responded to. So when they are dissatisfied, other motives are created as to why they're not satisfied, rather than I wonder what I can do to improve the response that works for them. And a large part of that would be to work with them to create it together, because there's much greater clarity that it's going to work in the future. because they've been part of its creation. So just finally, a reference I saw the other day which very much says similar things to, I think you'll find if you read it, what I've been saying today in terms of how people with difficulties are responded to. And I won't expand on it here. I'll leave you to read it or not at your choosing. But this, for me, is very similar to what I've been saying today. Next slide, please. So questions, and if there isn't time to answer them all, please send any further questions to me at this email address. Thank you very much for listening so far. But any questions, please?